Nina stood at the kitchen window, staring out at the garden bathed in the golden light of late afternoon. The world outside looked peaceful, orderly, a stark contrast to the quiet turmoil simmering beneath her composed exterior. She absent-mindedly twisted her wedding ring, a gesture she had grown accustomed to over the years. It was a symbol of a life that had become all too predictable. Her husband, Mark, was away again as he often was. His work demanded frequent travel, and even when he was home, his presence was more perfunctory than comforting. They had drifted apart gradually, like two boats untethered from the same dock, carried by unseen currents in opposite directions. Nina often wondered if he even noticed. The sound of the front door closing pulled her from her thoughts. She turned to see Ethan, Mark's son from his first marriage, walking into the room. At 25, Ethan was a striking figure, tall and confident, with an easy charm that seemed to radiate from him effortlessly. He had moved back home recently, claiming he needed time to establish himself as a photographer. "Hey Nina," Ethan said, setting his camera bag on the counter. "You've been in here all afternoon. Everything okay?" His question was casual, but the warmth in his tone caught her off guard. It wasn't the sort of thing Mark would ask. She forced a smile. "I'm fine, just lost in thought." Ethan leaned against the counter, studying her. "You know, you should let me photograph you sometime." The suggestion made her laugh, though the sound came out more uncertain than amused. "Me? I'm hardly the model type." "Are you kidding?" Ethan tilted his head, his eyes narrowing as if framing her in an imaginary lens. "You've got this classic elegance like those old Hollywood stars. It's rare to see that anymore." Heat rose to Nina's cheeks, and she looked away, pretending to adjust a vase on the table. Compliments from Mark had become so rare that she barely knew how to receive them from anyone else. "That's sweet of you to say, but I wouldn't know what to do in front of a camera." Ethan shrugged, a playful grin tugging at his lips. "That's my job. You just have to be yourself." The conversation lingered in her mind long after Ethan left the room. It was a simple remark, but it stirred something in her, a longing to be seen, to feel like more than a shadow in someone else's life. Later that evening, as Nina prepared dinner, Rachel called. Her best friend's voice was a welcome distraction from her thoughts. "How are things, really?" Rachel asked, her tone direct as always. Nina hesitated, glancing toward the empty chair at the head of the table where Mark usually sat today. "Same as always. Mark's busy and I'm here." Rachel sighed. "You sound like you're stuck in a rut. You deserve more than just existing, Nina. When's the last time you did something for yourself?" "I don't even know what that would look like anymore," Nina admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Rachel's words lingered long after their conversation ended. That night, as she lay in bed, Nina found herself thinking about Ethan's offer. The idea of standing in front of his camera was both terrifying and exhilarating. It felt like an opportunity to reclaim a piece of herself that had been buried beneath years of routine and compromise. The next morning, she found Ethan in the living room, editing photos on his laptop. The soft glow from the screen illuminated his face, and he looked up as she entered. "Is that offer still open?" she asked, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. Ethan's expression brightened. "Course. Are you serious?" She nodded, a small smile breaking through her apprehension. "Why not? Maybe it's time I try something new." Ethan's enthusiasm was infectious. "You won't regret it," he said, already pulling his camera from its bag. As Nina stood in the makeshift studio Ethan had set up in the sunroom, she felt a strange mix of vulnerability and excitement. She wasn't just posing for a photograph. She was stepping into uncharted territory, confronting feelings she hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge. "Relax," Ethan said softly, his voice guiding her through the session. "You're doing great." For the first time in years, Nina felt truly seen. The following days passed in a haze, the memory of Ethan's photography session lingering in Nina's mind like the faint aroma of a long-extinguished candle. She had expected to feel silly or self-conscious in front of the camera, but instead the experience had awakened something within her, a spark she hadn't realized she'd lost. Ethan, too, seemed different after that day. His gaze lingered a fraction longer during their conversations, his tone gentler when he spoke to her. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Nina felt the shift like a tremor beneath the surface. One evening, as the rain tapped lightly against the windows, Nina found Ethan in the sunroom again, his laptop glowing faintly in the dim light. He glanced up as she entered, his expression softening. Couldn't sleep. She shook her head, folding her arms as she leaned against the doorframe. Oh, too much on my mind, I guess. Ethan gestured toward the seat beside him. "Want to see the photos we took? I was just finishing up the edits." Her heart fluttered at the invitation, but she masked it with a casual nod. "Sure." As she sat beside him, the proximity felt charged, as though the air between them held a secret only they understood. Ethan navigated through the photos, each frame capturing a version of herself she hadn't recognized in years. Confident, radiant, alive. "These are beautiful," she whispered, her voice tinged with awe. Ethan glanced at her, a faint smile playing on his lips. "It's all you, Nina. I just captured what was already there." Her breath hitched, the compliment cutting deeper than she expected. She looked away, suddenly aware of how close they were, how easily their knees brushed beneath the table. "You've got a real talent," she said, her tone deflective as she straightened in her chair. "Mark must be proud of how far you've come." Ethan's smile faded, replaced by a shadow of something darker. "He doesn't really care about my work. Never has." Nina frowned, the vulnerability in his voice tugging at her. "That's not true. He just has his own way of showing it." Ethan gave a bitter laugh. By ignoring me completely. By treating my passions like their hobbies instead of real ambitions." His words hit uncomfortably close to home, echoing her own frustrations with Mark. She reached out instinctively, placing a hand on Ethan's arm. "You deserve better than that, Ethan. You're talented, and anyone with eyes can see it." He turned to her, his expression softening as his gaze met hers. The room felt suddenly smaller, the rain outside muffled by the weight of unspoken truths hanging in the air. "Sometimes I think you're the only person who really sees me," Ethan said, his voice low and intimate. Nina's heart pounded, her hand still resting on his arm. She should have pulled away, should have ended this conversation before it went any further, but something rooted her in place. "You don't mean that," she said weakly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I do," he said, his eyes searching hers. "And I think you feel it too." The words hung between them, heavy and undeniable. For a fleeting moment, Nina let herself imagine what it would be like to give in, to close the distance between them, to feel wanted and understood in a way she hadn't in years. But reality came crashing back, sharp and unyielding. She stood abruptly, her hand falling from his arm. "I should go," she said, her voice unsteady. Ethan didn't stop her, but his eyes followed her as she left the room, his expression a mixture of longing and regret. Back in her bedroom, Nina sat on the edge of the bed, her head in her hands. The lines she had promised herself never to cross were blurring, and she felt powerless to stop it. Ethan wasn't just Mark's son. He was also the only person who made her feel truly alive. She glanced at the clock, the hours creeping closer to midnight. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the rain. She knew she couldn't let this go any further, but the thought of cutting Ethan out completely filled her with a deep, aching sadness. The sound of her phone buzzing jolted her from her thoughts. It was a message from Rachel. "Are you okay? You've been on my mind." Nina stared at the screen, her finger hovering over the reply button. She wanted to confide in her friend, to confess the storm brewing in her heart, but the words felt too dangerous to put into text. Instead, she placed the phone face down on the nightstand and lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. Sleep didn't come easily that night, and when it did, her dreams were filled with images of Ethan's eyes, his touch, and the impossible choice she knew she would have to make. The next morning, Nina awoke to sunlight streaming through the curtains. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made her chest feel heavy. As she padded into the kitchen, the faint smell of coffee greeted her. Ethan was already there, leaning against the counter with a mug in hand. His hair tousled from sleep. "Morning," he said, his voice casual, though his eyes betrayed something deeper. "Morning," she replied, her tone clipped as she busied herself with pouring her own cup. She could feel his gaze on her, and it made her pulse quicken. The tension between them had become palpable, an unspoken weight that hung in every glance and every word. She could still hear his voice from the night before. "You're the only person who really sees me." The memory sent a shiver through her, equal parts exhilaration and dread. "I was thinking we could do another shoot today," Ethan said, breaking the silence. "If you're up for it." Nina hesitated, her hand gripping the edge of the counter. She knew she should say no, that spending more time alone with him would only fan the flames of this dangerous attraction. But part of her craved the way he looked at her, the way he made her feel. "I don't think that's a good idea," she said finally, her voice softer than she intended. Ethan set his mug down, stepping closer. "Why not? You seemed to enjoy it last time." She turned to face him, her heart pounding. "It's not about whether I enjoyed it. It's about," her words faltered as she searched his face, the vulnerability there disarming her. "It's about what's right." He took another step closer, his voice low and insistent. "And what if what's right doesn't feel right? What if this," he gestured between them, "is the only thing that does?" Nina's breath caught. She knew she should shut him down, put an end to this before it spiraled further out of control, but his words struck a chord deep within her. For years, she had been navigating a life that felt like a series of obligations, a script she hadn't written. And now, here was Ethan, offering her something raw and real, however forbidden it might be. Before she could respond, the sound of the front door opening startled them both. Mark's voice echoed from the hallway. "Nina, I'm home." The moment shattered like glass, and Nina stepped back abruptly, her face flushed. "We'll talk later," she whispered, avoiding Ethan's gaze as she hurried to greet her husband. Mark entered the kitchen with his usual brisk energy, setting his suitcase down by the door. "It's good to be back," he said, giving Nina a brief kiss on the cheek. "How have things been?" "Fine," she replied, forcing a smile. "The usual." Mark's eyes flicked to Ethan, who had retreated to the other side of the room, his expression carefully neutral. "Good to see you, son," Mark said, though his tone was more perfunctory than warm. "Yeah, you too," Ethan replied, his voice lacking its usual confidence. The awkwardness in the room was palpable, and Nina busied herself with tidying up, her mind racing. The dynamic between the three of them felt precarious, like a house of cards ready to collapse. That evening, as Mark caught up on work in his office, Nina found herself wandering into the sunroom again. Ethan was there, as she had expected, staring out the window. He turned when he heard her, his expression a mixture of longing and frustration. "This can't keep happening," she said, her voice firm despite the turmoil in her chest. "Mark's back and we can't keep doing this." Ethan stepped closer, his eyes searching hers. "Doing what?" "Talking. Being honest with each other." "You know it's more than that," she said, her voice breaking. "We've crossed a line, and if we don't stop now, there's no going back." He reached for her hand, his touch sending a jolt through her. "Nina, I can't pretend this isn't real. I know you feel it too." She pulled her hand away, tears pricking at her eyes. "It doesn't matter how I feel. This is wrong, Ethan. It has to end." The pain in his expression was almost too much to bear, but she forced herself to turn and walk away. As she left the room, she felt a mixture of relief and heartbreak, knowing that she had done the right thing even as it tore her apart. That night, as she lay beside Mark, who was already fast asleep, Nina stared at the ceiling. The house was quiet again, but the silence felt heavier now, filled with words unspoken and choices unmade. She knew she had to find a way to fix what was broken in her marriage or walk away from it entirely. But one thing was certain, She couldn't let herself fall any further into the web she and Ethan had woven.